Wisconsin Eye's coverage of Campaign 2014 is being brought to you by the Wisconsin Hospital Association. For over 90 years, a valued voice supporting Wisconsin hospitals in communities like yours.
Wisconsin Eye coverage of the 2014 elections continue with an interview with State Senator Glenn Grothman. He's a Republican from West Bend. He's running for the 6th Congressional District in the primary. Just a reminder, thanks to the Wisconsin Hospital Association for sponsoring our coverage of the elections. Glenn, welcome back to Wisconsin Eye.
Always glad to be on Wisconsin Eye.
You're an Assistant Majority Leader of the Senate. You have been a part of the major policy debates over the last several years. Boy, why run for Congress, Glenn?
Because the biggest problems the state faces are really caused by the federal government. I have tried in Madison to do something about an out-of-control welfare system, and we can nip at the edges, but the underlying problem is the welfare system the federal government gives us. I care a lot about our schools, but over time, our schools are going to be taken over or run by the federal government as they put more money into our schools and issue more regulations around our schools. So you've got to handle that. On regulation of our businesses, again and again, when I find businesses complain to me about something, it may be something that's administered by the state of Wisconsin, but they're underlying federal rules, be they labor law rules, be they environmental rules, be they other workplace rules.
So you want to go, you see then Washington as the heart of the problem?
Oh, no question. And I'll tell you this, Steve, no matter how good a job we do in Madison, and there are other good things we can do in Madison, if they don't turn things around in Washington, to me in the next 2 to 4 years, our country is sunk.
Sunk as in financially, morally, what?
All. We have the welfare system is causing a continued breakdown in the work ethic as well as a breakdown in the family.
Okay.
We have a situation in which the value of the dollar is at risk. How long can you keep borrowing over a 30-year budget? And that's before the Federal Reserve prints money on their own, just tens of billions of dollars a month. Okay. I mean, those two things above all, I think, have got to be addressed almost immediately or you're past the point of no return.
The top subject that you've now mentioned twice is welfare. You'd go to Washington and do what with the welfare system?
Okay, first of all, so your listeners understand what the problem is. Right now, let's say you have a single parent, could be a mom, could be a dad, making 15 grand a year. That person is eligible in benefits between the food stamps and the low-income housing and the free health care and the free daycare and the free, earned income tax credit, before we get to other things, for over $40,000 in benefits. If that guy or gal gets married to the mother or father of their children, you could lose $40,000.
Democrats call it a safety net.
$40,000. I'll ask you this, Steve. I know you're married, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. If your wife would have lost $40,000 a year by marrying you, would she have married you? I bet she would have hesitated. So I don't blame the single parents out there.
I'm glad she's not here. Okay,
right.
Go ahead, Glenn.
But, and I know many wonderful single parents. I'm just saying, when you have that much of a penalty for getting married, over time, more and more people realize it. And they begin to say, I can't get married. I have given this speech in various forms over the last, I'd say, 10 years. And I begin to have people come up to me with stories. This couple had a child, and they always expected to get married. 3 years later, they want to get married, and they find out what they're losing, and they can't get married. Okay? This is got to be addressed, or the nuclear family that is so much the backbone of our country is going to disappear altogether.
But what is the duties? What duties does the federal government what responsibility does the federal government have to the lowest income? If it's $40,000 through earned income tax cut and health care and child care, which of those should be either eliminated or all but eliminated?
Well, first of all, a lot of this shouldn't be a federal problem. Under our Constitution, this is none of a federal problem. It should all be a state and local problem. But our federal government has taken it over, and I suppose you can't just pull the rug out from people immediately, though it would be a good idea to maybe put some of this in a block grant, get rid of all the rules related to it, and say, here, states, you deal with it. Because again and again, as we administer our programs, a problem we have is you can't do this, you can't do that, or you have to ask for a waiver from the federal government. Now, what do we have to do? I think you don't want to have people starving in the streets, obviously, but the problem right now is frequently these programs result in people doing better than people who are working. Okay, you can get right now in Madison, for example, the low-income housing apartments may be better than the ones that aren't low-income housing. All you have to do to talk to any clerk in any food store, and they will tell you that the people on food share are frequently eating better than the people not on food share. Talk to people in low-income housing and ask them, or who administer the low-income housing, and ask people what they do when that earned income tax credit, maybe $8,000, $9,000 come out. I mean, they're going on vacations, buying luxury goods, that sort of thing, as many people in our society would if all of a sudden they got an $8,000 check. So it is just far too generous. And what's happening, Steve, is what one can expect to happen. You begin to have a decline in the work ethic, and you have a situation in which more and more people are saying, well, materially I can make a go of it. Why would I want to form an old-fashioned family?
Okay, another thing you mentioned, thanks for listing 3 issues. You also mentioned schools. Now, you have been a part of the K-12 debate in Wisconsin for a long time, but you're saying that Wisconsin is going to lose control over its schools because of issues like Common Core, or what?
Common Core, yes, that would be a very good example. Over time, you know, and I was a critic back in 2001 or 2002 when it passed. I was critical of George Bush at the time.
For No Child Left Behind?
For No Child Left Behind.
All right.
Whenever the federal government puts more money in schools, eventually politicians in Washington, rather than going back home and running for the state legislature like they should, can't help but resist saying, I'm going to do something about schools. It's very difficult to get the federal government to change, not only to get them to change statutorily, but then rules are issued by the Federal Department of Education, and we wind up losing control. And over time, government agencies rarely lessen control. The answer is, because I don't know politically you could pull all the money out from what the federal government's doing, though I wouldn't mind doing that. The answer would be to say, okay, again, we're going to block grant this back to the states, the amount of money they're getting, maybe a 10% cut there. And in addition to that, we're going to get rid of the bureaucrats on a federal level. There are all sorts of people working for the Federal Department of Education. I occasionally see them in my district when they show up and they give an award to a local school for being a super school or something. I don't need some federal bureaucrat to show up in Slinger, Wisconsin. And
so you would abolish Arne Duncan's agency?
Yes.
You would?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you. Good introduction. Now let's talk about specific issues. Medicare and Social Security, you're going to go broke within X number of years. How would you fix them?
Okay, I think on Social Security, ultimately, not for the people who are waiting right now, but down the road, maybe people under age 40, whatever, you have to begin to maybe raise the retirement age or jiggle a little bit with the benefits. On Medicare, the problem you have with Medicare is the problem you have with our whole medical system. There are no incentives for the individual to watch their own costs. And there's a problem we have in the private sector. Mm-hmm. One of the things we are going to do in the state of Wisconsin, we should duplicate on a federal level, is begin to take the employees and begin to offer them a market-based reform. Okay, in my district, a guy by the name of John Torinas has written a book, does a very good job in his own company. This is beginning to be done in places like the West Bend School District, where you begin to have market-based health insurance, which results in a huge savings. But among other things, what it does is it changes the culture within the medical community itself. There are certain areas, Steve, in which medical costs have fallen. Areas like LASIK surgery, areas like cosmetic surgery. Costs have fallen. Why? Because it's pure pre-market. We have to get more free market involved in other medical procedures. Right now it's not, because you don't have a large enough segment of the population in market-based plans. You can get more of that culture just through the huge sea of federal employees, and then you've got to begin to put that culture in the Medicare, Medicaid world as well.
Let's talk about the Affordable Care Act. President Obama says it's a success because 7 or 8 million more people have health care. Your response as a candidate in the 6th?
No, it's a failure. Over 80% of the American public was satisfied with their health care plan. I believe that's the poll I saw, but the vast majority of the public were satisfied with their health care plan before we did this. Okay, it is not like America to stick its nose in and make that large a percentage of the population dependent on government for health care. And you got to remember, some of the people who are going to signing up for Obamacare had another health care plan before. So I can't say it's a positive. Is it a positive to switch from a private plan to a government plan? I don't consider that a positive. Now, I think Barack Obama wanted that because one of his goals is to make as many people dependent on the government for as many things as possible, but I don't think that's a good thing. No, we ought to pull back to the degree possible. We ought to get back to the old system, and with the old system, we've got to, as I said with Medicare and Medicaid, push more and more towards market-based reforms. We did have more and more people in HSAs over time, but I think as you get, like I said, the federal employees on there, as over time more and more government employees get on there, you're going to change the culture within the medical provider community, and you're going to see costs fall. And as you see costs fall, health insurance will be easier for the population as a whole to afford.
One of the ways that your party has argued about that healthcare consumers should be more informed is HSAs.
Right.
Do those work, or are those failures?
Oh, absolutely they work. They work because right now, and I'll say right now, I don't have an HSA. I don't go to a doctor a lot, but when I go to a doctor, quite frankly, I haven't shopped because my insurance pays for it. But I think over time, with an HSA, you have people shopping on price and questioning whether all these procedures are necessary.
Those that are in this country illegally, the immigration question, what would you do? Should there be a path to citizenship? I heard Amnesty argued yesterday. Well, what's your position?
No, we can't have amnesty because we can't have people who break the law being put ahead of people who aren't breaking the law. Right now in this country, we have people waiting to get here legally who may be on a waiting list for more than 10 years. Meanwhile, you have people who snuck across the border. I think what you have to do in the future is we select people for this country, and we need a lot of immigrants in this country. All you got to do is look around and see the jobs the immigrants are performing. And our country's always been a country of immigrants.
Especially on dairy farms in the 6th Congressional District.
Exactly. But I think what we have to do is we have to say, rather than say priority goes to people who are sneaking across the border, priority has to go to people who have jobs lined up, people vouching for them, that sort of thing. And we can get more than enough people in this country by doing that rather than just saying amnesty. I mean, it makes no sense. You know, and this is, by the way, fault of both parties. People have been critical of Barack Obama for not enforcing the laws, letting everybody come across the border. That was a problem for George Bush as well, who also basically wasn't enforcing the immigration laws, and not enough Republicans were calling him out on that at the time. So what you have to do is you have to go back to a situation in which we are letting people here, but are selecting the people who come here. If you had to pick, Steve, between the type of people who are waiting in Mexico or Costa Rica or wherever, who are filling out the forms, dutifully doing everything right, and taking the people who are sneaking across the border, who are going to make better citizens in general. It's kind of obvious, and apparently for the last, we're almost on 20 years now, under presidents of both parties, they've decided America would be better with the new generations of America being the type of people sneaking across the border. The other thing, Steve, just to finish up, right now in Mexico, to use one country, people advertise the generosity of the welfare benefits in this country. Now, I have heard mixed messages whether the American government is partly responsible for that. I have heard people tell me that it might be the organizations who make money, transferring money back to Mexico. I don't know who's doing it, but it's out there. And the idea of making the United States the welfare magnet for the Western Hemisphere is just insane. Thousands
of young children from Honduras, Guatemala are now showing up and crossing the borders without their parents. They're as young as 6. One 6-year-old caring for her 4-year-old sibling. What would you do with these thousands of children?
Well, we have to, the degree possible, find a way to get them back to their parents. I mean, it's just a horrible thing, and insofar as we can determine the country, give them to that country. I mean, these countries are not the worst countries in the world. Mexico is, by world standards, there are many countries poorer than Mexico, for example. So I don't think Mexico is such a horrible country that it's a horrible thing to send people to live there.
Okay. New subject, same-sex marriage. Your reaction to Judge Crabb's ruling?
It was horrific. And I think it's embarrassing more Republicans aren't speaking out on the issue. I mean, our country, to me, is built on, or one of the most important amendments is freedom of religion, which means, to me, that there are a variety of people with different religions in this country, but it's always been a primarily Christian country. And when you begin to make same-sex marriage legal, in essence, you're telling people that it's no big deal about homosexuality. And really the younger generation should, to me, consider it an option. I think that's a horrible message to tell the younger people. And the fact that we have a federal judge who's been out of control before, this federal judge, by the way, struck down the National Day of Prayer, so it tells you where she's coming from, but that we have a federal judge saying this is required, when not only is it against the state constitution, but throughout most of this country's history was illegal as well. shows what a bad judiciary we have. I guess one thing that should be done on a state level is they ought to be improving the law schools, because, you know, I mean, how can you say you can trust judges to interpret the Constitution and enforce the Constitution when basically what you have is judges just giving their opinions on things?
If the U.S. Supreme Court issues a ruling striking down the bans on same-sex marriage in all these states, including Wisconsin, what's the reaction of you if you're a member of the U.S. House?
Well, I'll sign on to a constitutional amendment clarifying where we are on that. I doubt whether it would pass. Clearly, elected officials and clergy have to do a better job on this issue. Right now, there is a special interest group that has a lot of power in the entertainment media. They have a lot of power in our schools, where they've been preaching that same-sex marriage is no big deal, or at least homosexuality is no big deal, which is one of the reasons why we're losing this issue among the young. And they've been very aggressive in other areas of government as well. So I think we have to do a better job of informing the public what Christian teaching is here and why Christian teaching is what it is, because it would be just horrible if the U.S. Supreme Court reached such a decision. And just horrible.
Campaign finance issues. Some Democrats want to, you spoke of a constitutional amendment on that issue. Some Democrats want a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. Your reaction?
Well, there may be some people who have a problem with the First Amendment. I don't have a problem with the First Amendment. I don't like to pass constitutional amendments poking holes in the First Amendment.
Is the campaign finance system broken when third-party groups who don't have to identify?
Yes, it's a huge problem, Steve.
How would you fix it?
Well, I think what you have to do is you have to open up the limits on individual candidates. The reason these third-party groups are so big is because people artificially said you can only give so much, or individual candidates can only spend so much. Given the huge stake that we have in government today, which was, and our forefathers never guessed government would be this important in our lives, it shouldn't be. So many people have a big stake in government that they're willing to pour tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into U.S. Senate races, congressional races, what have you. It would be far better for us to know who is giving money than not, and you wouldn't have such a run to special interest money or special, these independent expenditures if you had larger limits on the individual accounts.
So pop the limits, but everybody would have to would have to file statements
then would solve the
where
problem.
They got the money.
Another problem you're having, by the way, just so you know, is right now we have a meanness in American politics, and we saw it during the Governor Walker recalls. And that is huge bodies of employees are threatening to boycott or punish people who exercise their rights to give money to one candidate or the other. And that's another problem we have. That just has to be, maybe we can embarrass these groups who called for boycotts in the past. I mean, I have the same problem. You call somebody and say, you know, can you give me $100 bucks? Can you give me $500 bucks? And they say, you know, Glenn, I don't know if I want to see my name on your report for fear that somebody is going to boycott my business, and they will.
Well, some groups say we ought to have a publicly financed system of elections.
I'm not willing to go there. I mean, we're broke. The idea of politicians paying for political ads is not something I'm willing to quite go for quite yet.
Okay. What lessons about fighting international terrorism and limitations to U.S. foreign policy do you take away from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I think the Iraqi war in particular was poorly administered. Not the war so much as the peace. I mean, one of the things that always bothered me about Iraq, and of course it's a mess there right now, and I blame both President Bush and President Obama for that, in the most successful wars we fought, World War II, the United States went in and they largely westernized Germany and Japan. As a matter of fact, I believe today the Nazi Party is still illegal in Germany 60, 70 years later. In Iraq, almost immediately, they allowed very anti-American groups to continue to preach their vitriol against the United States. Well, you got to shut these things down. When we took over Germany after World War II, we didn't allow the Nazis to keep publishing newspapers out there and allowing, terrorist activity to go on. We realized that was not practical. That's kind of what we allowed in Iraq, and because we never squashed the people who hate America, it's not surprising that as we leave, they're right back there. So the major thing I take over is we should not have a lack of self-confidence in that an American form of government is great. And another thing about Iraq, George Bush talked about giving Iraq a democracy. We're not a democracy, Steve. We're a republic. And maybe if George Bush would have tried to give Iraq a republic instead of a democracy and educated Iraqis on what a republic is, we wouldn't have these problems today either.
Given the two examples of Iraq and Afghanistan, when should America put, to use the term, boots on the ground? Our American soldiers?
Well, I suppose when our vital interests are at stake. And they have to determine that on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Energy policy. Do you support the Keystone Pipeline?
Yes.
Why?
Well, because A, it's jobs, and B, we want America to be energy independent.
Another question on foreign policy. Was the exchange of 5 Taliban terrorists for 1 soldier worth it?
It's ridiculous. I mean, can you imagine again in any other war us doing that? 5 leaders of the opposition for 1 person? I mean, first of all, it's unfair on its face. Secondly, it's going to encourage grabbing more Americans. I mean, if you can get rid of 5 top al-Qaeda operatives by grabbing an American, I mean, to me, I think it's totally scary. I mean, maybe all of a sudden they're going to be grabbing an American tourist in Turkey or something like that and saying, off they go. They're going to show up in Afghanistan and say, okay, we want another 10 people out of your prisons or whatever. Then what are we going to do? That's just a horrible precedent.
You announced that you were going to challenge Congressman Pichai before he announced his retirement. What had he done wrong that you were going to challenge him, Glenn?
Well, he kind of defines what's wrong with the Republicans in Congress. I mean, from 2001 to 2007, when the Republicans were in charge, they increased spending quicker than spending was going up under Bill Clinton. And that's even if you leave out military spending. On the issues like No Child Left Behind, I noticed there was an amendment in which Pichai asked to spend more money than even George Bush, I believe, requested, or than was originally requested in the bill. I mean, if you believe that Republicans have not been aggressive on spending, if they haven't been outspoken enough on the dependency culture and welfare, I think Tom Pichai was one of those people who was clearly one of the problem children. He's a nice guy. Nobody could argue that. But like I said, I think we have 2 or 4 years, 6 years left to turn this country around. And given his past history, Tom Pichai was not a guy who was going to be fighting to turn things around. 2
final questions. Number one, I want to give you a chance to highlight any issues that you are running on that I haven't asked about, sir.
Okay, well, the big 3 I talk about for my stump speech is the welfare, is the government regulation, including affirmative action, which is something that is dividing our country and is a problem for American business, and schools and federal involvement in schools. Like other Republicans, we got to get rid of Obamacare. I think my record on balancing budgets and voting no on the Finance Committee is second to none, and I realize we've got to buck up the value of the dollar. I'll aggressively look for auditing the Fed and highlighting the huge scandal that is the Federal Reserve as they've pumped tens of billions of dollars into our least deserving citizens. I'd like to eventually look at student loan debt. I don't think we can do things retroactively, but prospectively, I think we should put a cap on the amount of student loan debt that is not eligible for bankruptcy. And by the way, what would happen there is you wouldn't be granting so many student loans in the first place. We should not have a situation in which young people are graduating from college with $60,000 or $70,000, an undergraduate degree with $60,000 or $70,000 in student loans, because it's just ruining too many kids' lives. I know your university bureaucrats are going to fight it because they like the big cash coming in, but we've got to put a situation in which these young people have a life to live.
Then final question, Glenn. You're running against 2 fellow Republicans who are office holders.
Right.
You want to talk about your differences between Representative Strobel and Senator Leibham?
Well, I think passion and leadership on conservative issues. I mean, right now there's a lack of leadership in Washington, and whether you're talking about government spending, government regulation, welfare, on a wide variety of issues in Madison, Steve, I don't think there's anybody who's been out front more than I have. And I like Joe, I like Dewey. They're both good Christian people. But I think if you look at who's been out in front fighting, trying to drive the Republicans to the right, I think there's nobody like me. And if you want somebody in the 6th Congressional District who is going to try to drive those Republicans in Washington to not repeat the mistakes they made in 2001 to 2007, I am the guy. I will try to embarrass them into action if they don't take action on their own.
Excellent. We're out of time. Senator Glenn Grothman of West Bend is a Republican candidate in the 6th Congressional District. Glenn, thanks for coming in.
Glad to be on the show, Steve.
Thank you.